Greetings and welcome to another lesson in introductory psychology. This one deals with social psychology, specifically how we develop attitudes. Now remember, an attitude is a tendency, it's an enduring tendency for a person to think about something or feel about something or react to something in a particular way. And despite the many times you may have been accused of being born with an attitude, no one is born with an attitude. We develop them, we learn them. So the question is, of course, where do we learn these attitudes? Where do we learn to react or think or feel in certain ways? Well, one of the first ways, of course, that we learn to react is from our parents. We watch those around us. Whenever you see a child, or any person for that matter, in a new or different situation, they very often try to figure out how to act by looking at the people around them and seeing what these people do. How are they reacting? Okay? And so children learn from their parents not only how to react to situations, but what to think about things, how to feel about things. And sometimes this is direct instruction. Sometimes you will literally have parents sit down and go, no, that is bad, or this is terrible. But a lot of it is observational. If parents, for instance, always talk about certain things in a particular way, or they react to certain things in a particular way, we're even talking not only things like how to react to different types of people or situations, but also something like how people react to spiders. Okay, you might be told spiders are bad, and then if there's a big spider around, you might see people, squeal and run around or whatever. So you're learning an attitude towards spiders. They're scary, you need to run away. And a lot of that is through observational learning. Even if we aren't directly instructed, we can learn by watching the reactions of those around us and decide how we ourselves should react, how we should think, how we should feel. This is very powerful, this sort of early learning, because this is why we think we're born with an attitude. It's because we learn this stuff so early, we don't even remember learning it. We don't even know we're learning it. It's as if we were born with it, even though we're not. We also have direct contact. How do you develop an attitude towards something? Because you encounter it directly. I've lived in Florida for quite a while. We're talking probably a total of about 10 years. And I knew about hurricanes before I lived in Florida, not that I had ever really been in one. But my attitudes toward hurricanes changed a bit once I basically experienced one. Okay, and I probably look at hurricanes slightly differently than someone who never has. So direct contact with something can indeed change your attitude, create an attitude where there might not have been one before. Membership in a particular group can have an effect on what attitudes we learn, how we react, how we think. I find it amusing sometimes to watch my students, many of whom in the great university rivalries, whether it's football rivalries or just general rivalries that you see around, many of which, when they are freshmen, for instance, at a community college, have really no opinion about which is better, this school or that school, until they start attending one of those schools when they transfer. And then all of a sudden, we're great, they're terrible, rah, rah. They developed an attitude because now they're a member of this group. I am a member of this group, therefore I feel this way, I think this way, I act this way. It happens more often than we care to think about. That declaring ourselves as a member of a group can cause us to change our attitudes, develop new ones, drop old ones. The media. How did I learn about hurricanes before I moved to Florida? I watched the Weather Channel. How do you learn about people who live in faraway places that you may never have met? You watch TV, you watch movies, you read books, you get on the internet. The media definitely colors our views of other people, of other situations. If you, for instance, examples I like to use, for instance, having lived in the South, but not having grown up here, people who have never been to the southern part of the United States tend to have certain attitudes about what the people there are like. And they're not particularly complimentary attitudes. In fact, a lot of attitudes toward other people are not complimentary. I'll talk more about that when I talk about prejudice, unfortunately. But, people in the South are kind of slow, and they're not very smart, and they're a little inbred, and they like NASCAR, and they have dental problems. And granted, a lot of these things have kernels of truth to them. The problem is, if you watch the mass media, that's all you see. You see very few people from the southeastern part of the United States, for instance, who are portrayed as being brilliant, particularly if they have a southern accent. Having a southern accent is viewed by many people who have southern accents as being a liability, because you come out with this lovely thick southern drawl and people automatically think you're some kind of reactionary moron, which is almost certainly not true. There are actually classes for people to lose their southern accent because they want to be taken seriously by people in other parts of the country. Why? Because we have an attitude we've learned from the media about people from the South. Or we have attitudes about other individuals we may not have run into in our day-to-day lives. As an example, since 9/11, when you see Muslims, people who follow Islam, in the news, assuming that you don't have direct contact, what do you tend to associate people who are Muslim or followers of Islam with? Unfortunately, in this country, we tend to associate them with violence and terrorism, which is not true. It's a minute fraction of the followers of Muhammad, or anyone else for that matter. You know, Christians have had their moments of being rather violent and terroristic themselves, but we don't see them portrayed like that in our media. So the media can definitely color your view in a good way or often a bad way as to what individuals are like, what situations are like, what places are like. I know people, for instance, who are terrified to do something like take a trip by themselves because all they see on the news are horrible things happening. All they see on the news are people getting mugged and killed and whatnot. And the odds of that happening are actually very, very small. But people believe them, partly because of the mean worldview. Now, I have been teaching psychology for a while. I taught psychology both before September 11th, 2001 and after. And that was indeed a big turning point in not only a lot of people's lives, including mine. I was in New York on that day, but also in the terms of the way we view the world. Because before September 11th, 2001, Americans tended to think that everyone liked us. I mean, there were some exceptions, but everyone liked us. And we were the good guys, and people were happy to see us. They wanted to be like us. And after that, we more or less slammed the gate shut. If you're not with us, you're against us. We became terrified of anyone who was not like us, who didn't look like us, people who wear different clothes from us, people who look different. We always have a little bit of xenophobia as part of our human makeup, unfortunately. Again, I'll talk about that when I talk about prejudice. But the mean worldview kind of takes that and explodes it. And so people are terrified of anything outside their own little world because everything out in the big wide world is scary and terrifying and out to get you. As another example, I give you, well, hopefully not literally, but I give you the example of child abductions, kidnappings. If you watch the media and you contribute this mean worldview in, it helps explains why a lot of parents are terrified of letting their children out of their sight. They're terrified of letting their children go outside by themselves, go outside to play. These days we're terrified of letting our children go to school or go to the mall. Because what's out there, crazy people with guns, terrorists, kidnappers, rapists. I mean, the world is just crawling with dangerous things. So parents are literally afraid to let their children out of their sight. I know parents who will not let their children go out in the front yard by themselves, and they can only go in the backyard because it's fenced. And even then, they want to keep an eye on them. This is a relatively recent development. When I was growing up, I grew up in a suburban area, and I had a lot of freedom. I would take off on my bike in the morning. I'd come back for lunch. I'd take off on my bike again in the afternoon, come back before the street lights came on, because that was the rule. My parents didn't know where I was. Cell phones hadn't been invented yet. They didn't know where I was. And yes, they worried. I've asked my mother recently about my times I did that. She said, yes, I was worried, but I let you go. And, these days, if a parent allowed their child to take off without a cell phone and without any contact, not only would fellow parents probably, tell them they're a horrible parent, there might be legal action. because we are so convinced that any time a child is out of our sight, they're going to be kidnapped, they're going to be raped, they're going to be murdered. When in actuality, the odds of that happening are extremely low. If you look at the rates of kidnapping and who does kidnapping in our world, here in the US, you will find that the vast majority of child abductions are done by relatives and friends of the child, people the child knows. Non-custodial parents lead the pack. Parent doesn't have custody, they grab their kids, they run. Other relatives, people, like I said, people the child knows. There are very, very, very few true stranger abductions in this country. Fewer than 200 a year in the country is the statistic that I've seen. And yet, I mean, so the odds of a child being kidnapped by a stranger is less probably than them tripping over a shoelace and breaking their neck. And yet we don't see parents terrified of shoelaces. We're terrified of the outside world. I also suspect this is at least a contributor to the childhood obesity epidemic we're seeing. Because when I was young, kids went outside and played. In fact, our parents told us to do that when we got on their nerves. Go outside, run around for a while. Now parents don't do that. So what do kids do? They stay at home, they play video games, they watch TV, they get on the computer, they eat. Because their parents are terrified. I also wonder, and you might be part of this generation, this cohort, what children are going to be like, what adults are going to be like if when they have grown up, they have been made absolutely terrified of everything outside of their house or their apartment. I really wonder sometimes how that is going to equip an adult for life in the real world. Not the world they're terrified of, not this mean world, but the real world. The real world, yes, you take chances, but usually things turn out okay. Or you can deal with them. I've driven across the country more times than I care to count. I've very rarely had problems. When I have, I fixed them. So it's just interesting to me to look at this mean worldview and how it really does color our attitudes and our behavior. Lastly, we have role playing. And this is very interesting. You would think that our attitudes would come from what we think and what we feel, and therefore our behaviors would reflect what we think and what we feel. In actuality, it looks like it works in the other direction. In actuality, when you read about cognitive dissonance is when our behavior contradicts our attitudes. When our behavior contradicts what we think and what we feel. And what's very interesting about cognitive dissonance is one would think that you would resolve it by changing your behavior to match what you think and what you feel, when in reality it looks like it's the other way. It appears that we look to our behavior to see what we think about something, how we feel about something. And in fact, if you can change someone's behavior, you can change their attitudes. The classic example of this would be something like the Zimbardo prison study, where everyday college students, literally pulled out of psychology classes in college, were randomly placed into one of two groups, one being guards and one being prisoners. And the students that were chosen as prisoners were taken down basically into a prison, quote unquote, that had been created in the basement of a psychology building at a campus in California. The prisoners were instructed to act like prisoners. The guards were instructed to act like guards. And what they found was within a day or two that everyone had gotten so sucked into their roles that they did not remember they were play acting. That the people who were pretending to be prisoners were allowing themselves to be abused, were allowing themselves to be harassed. And the people who were pretending to be guards were essentially torturing the individuals that were pretending to be prisoners. It wasn't a game anymore. It might have started out as fun. It might have started out as play. But they all looked at their behavior and said, if I'm behaving like this, this must be true. I must think like this. I must feel like this. Which, quite frankly, is a tad frightening. There have actually been some movies made of this. But I would recommend going, for instance, to there's a PBS series called Psychology that was made probably a long time ago now. They have some very interesting stuff done on the Zimbardo prison study, Zimbardo. If you're interested in how role-playing can change your attitudes, you might want to go look it up. Although I must warn you, it's really rather startling.